Imagine Marcus Aurelius with a phone. Not the philosopher emperor in the abstract, the actual man. The one who wrote privately about his failures, who struggled with impatience, who had to remind himself daily not to be moved by what people thought of him. That man, with a phone, with a comment section, with the specific, modern experience of waking up to find that something he said, or did, or believed has been taken, stripped of context, and distributed to an audience of strangers who have decided, before reading past the headline, exactly what kind of person he is. How would he handle it? Not with indifference. The Stoics were not indifferent. Not with the performance of composure that looks unbothered from the outside, while the replay runs privately for hours. Not with the dignified silence that is, in most cases, just suppression wearing a philosophical costume. With something more precise than any of those things. A specific, operational framework for meeting hate and criticism, viral or otherwise, without being destabilized by it. For processing the opinion of strangers in a way that costs nothing and produces something. For remaining in the middle of the loudest and most personal attacks, the person he intended to be. That framework is what this video is all about. Not how to feel better about criticism, but how to handle it the way Marcus Aurelius actually would, point by point. Starting now. Point number 1. Separate the opinion from the fact. There is a conflation that happens in the first seconds of receiving criticism. It happens before the considered version of you has had a chance to assess what arrived. Before the philosophical framework has been consulted, or the quality of the source has been evaluated, or the specific content of the criticism has been examined with any precision. In the first seconds, in the specific, immediate, visceral impact of a comment or a judgment or a public attack landing, the automated mind does something that feels like assessment, but isn't. It treats the opinion as a fact, not consciously, not through any deliberate decision to accept the criticism as accurate, but in the specific, felt sense of a person who has just been told something about themselves and whose internal conditions have shifted as though the thing told were true, regardless of whether it is. The comment that calls you dishonest and produces, immediately, the internal scramble of a person examining their honesty. The criticism that calls your work shallow and produces, immediately, the specific defensiveness of a person whose work has just been declared insufficient. The viral attack that assigns you a character and produces, immediately, the disorientation of a person trying to locate themselves in relation to the version of them that the attack has just constructed. None of this is assessment. It is the automated mind's default response to the social threat of negative judgment, a response that was built long before you started asking philosophical questions about it, and that operates, in the first seconds, entirely independently of whether the judgment is accurate. Marcus Aurelius was precise about this, not in the context of social media, but in the context of a public life that was scrutinized, criticized, and attacked with a consistency and a personal directness that most contemporary criticism cannot match. He wrote about the impression, the raw arrival of the judgment before the mind has processed it, and the specific, critical act of separating what arrived from what it means. The opinion of another person about you is not a fact about you. It is a fact about them, about their perspective, their values, their particular vantage point, their emotional state at the moment the judgment was formed, and the specific combination of information and misunderstanding and projection that produced the conclusion they have now delivered as though it were an objective assessment. This does not mean the opinion is wrong. Some criticism is accurate. Some of the harshest judgments contain the most useful information. But accurate or not, the opinion is still an opinion, still a perspective, still the product of a specific mind operating from a specific position with a specific set of limitations and biases and motivations that have nothing to do with the objective truth of who you are. The separation is the first move, not the evaluation of whether the criticism is accurate. That comes later, and it comes more clearly once the separation has been made. The prior act of recognizing in the first seconds of the impact that what arrived was an opinion, a perspective, a judgment formed by a specific person from a specific position, not a verdict, not a fact, not a definitive account of who you are that the internal conditions are now required to organize themselves around. An opinion, which may or may not contain something worth examining, but which, until it has been examined with the separation intact, has no authority over the internal conditions that the Stoic practice is maintaining. The practice is a single question, asked in the first seconds of the impact, before the automated response has completed its familiar movement from impression to destabilization. Is this a fact or an opinion? Not rhetorically. Actually, with the specific, honest willingness to acknowledge that some criticism contains genuine factual accuracy that the separation is not designed to dismiss, but with the equally specific recognition that the emotional weight the criticism carries, the destabilization, the defensiveness, the internal scramble, is not proportional to its accuracy. It is proportional to the automated mind's failure to make the separation. Make the separation before the evaluation, before the response, before the replay has begun and the internal conditions have been handed over to a stranger's opinion about who you are. An opinion arrived. That is all that happened. What you do with it, examine it, learn from it, discard it, or some combination of all three, is entirely yours to decide, but only after the separation has been made. Point number 2, the source determines the weight. Not all criticism deserves the same response. This sounds obvious, but in the first seconds of impact, when the comment has landed and the automated mind is already treating the opinion as a fact, it is almost never applied. The stranger with no context and the trusted colleague with full information receive, from the automated mind, the same emotional weight. The person with genuine insight and the person with an agenda produce the same internal scramble. This is the mistake, and it is expensive. Marcus Aurelius was direct about this. Before responding to any criticism, internally or externally, he asked one question: is this person qualified to assess what they are assessing? Not qualified in the credentialed sense, qualified in the specific sense of having the knowledge, the context, and the honest intention that accurate assessment requires. If yes, the criticism deserves serious examination, not defensive rejection, not the comfortable dismissal that protects the ego at the cost of genuine learning. Serious, honest, open examination of what the qualified source has identified. If no, the criticism deserves acknowledgement and release, not contempt, not the performance of indifference that is just suppressed reaction. Simple, clean release, because the opinion of a person without the context to assess you accurately is not information about you. It is information about them. The practice is one question asked before the emotional response completes. Does this person have what they need to assess this accurately? The answer determines the weight, and the weight determines everything that follows. 2 points in. If this framework is providing a clarity the rest of the digital world is designed to disrupt, then subscribe. Not to follow a creator, but to commit to a discipline. This channel is for the few who prefer the difficulty of self-examination to the comfort of the crowd. If that is you, stay with us. Point number 3, use it or release it. There is no third option. Most people do neither. They don't use the criticism, don't examine it honestly, they don't extract what is useful, and don't apply the specific corrective that the useful part supports. On the other hand, they also don't release it, don't set it down cleanly, don't leave it in the past where it belongs, and return their attention to the work that the criticism interrupted. They hold it in the specific, costly, entirely unproductive middle ground between examination and release, replaying it, returning to it, carrying it forward into the hours and days that follow without ever quite deciding what to do with it. And the holding is where almost all of the damage happens, not the criticism itself, the holding. Marcus Aurelius was precise about this. The criticism has arrived. The separation has been made. Opinion, not fact. The source has been assessed, qualified or not. Now one decision remains, and it is the most important one. Is there something here worth using? If yes, use it. Extract the specific, actionable insight that the honest examination reveals. Apply it. Let it change something concrete about the work or the behavior or the approach that the criticism identified. And then release the rest, the tone, the delivery, the personal charge that surrounded the useful core, because it has served its purpose, and holding it further produces nothing. If no, release it entirely. Not after one more examination. Not after the replay has confirmed for the fourth time that there is nothing useful here. Now, cleanly. With the specific, deliberate act of a person who has looked at what arrived, found nothing worth keeping, and returned their attention to where it belongs. The third option, holding without deciding, is not a neutral choice. Every hour spent in the middle ground is an hour of attention, clarity, and internal stability handed to a piece of criticism that was never worth that price. Use it or release it. Today, before the replay begins again. Point number 4. Steady is the response, not silence, not fire. When criticism arrives publicly, when the attack is visible, when the audience is watching, when the pressure to respond is real and immediate, and the automated mind is already reaching for one of its two familiar options, most people choose wrong. Not because they are weak, because the automated mind only has two settings for public attack: silence or fire. Silence, the dignified non-response that looks composed from the outside and is, in most cases, suppressed reaction looking for a later outlet. Or fire, the defensive counterattack that feels justified in the moment and costs significantly more than the original criticism did. Marcus Aurelius chose neither. He chose steady. Steady is not silence. It engages, clearly, directly, without the defensive charge that fire carries. It addresses what deserves addressing and leaves what doesn't, without pretending the criticism didn't arrive. Steady is not fire. It does not match the energy of the attack, does not elevate the critic by treating their criticism as worthy of an emotional response proportional to the disturbance it caused internally. Steady is the response of a person whose internal conditions have not been moved by what arrived, who can address the criticism from the same place they were standing before it came, who sounds, to the audience watching, like a person who was never quite as destabilized as the critic was hoping. That is the most powerful response available. Not the clever comeback, not the dignified silence. The steady, grounded, unmoved engagement of a person who processed the criticism before responding to it. One question before any public response: am I responding from steadiness or from the disturbance? If the disturbance is still running, wait. The steady response is always available, but only after the internal conditions have been restored to the place they were before the criticism arrived. Point number 5. The examined life needs no jury. This is the point that makes all the others possible. Not a technique, not a practice with a specific form or a question to ask in the moment of impact. A fundamental reorientation of the relationship between the internal conditions and the external judgment, one that, once genuinely absorbed, changes the cost of criticism permanently. Most people are living in relation to other people's opinions as though they are on trial, as though the jury of the people around them, the colleagues, the followers, the strangers in the comments section, the people whose approval was never sought, but whose disapproval still lands with surprising force, is the authoritative body that determines the verdict on who they are. And every piece of criticism is a new charge, to be examined, defended against, rebutted, or, in the worst cases, accepted as evidence that the jury's concerns are justified. Marcus Aurelius refused this framework entirely, not through the performance of indifference, through the genuine, daily, privately maintained practice of self-examination that made the jury's verdict irrelevant. Because the person who examines themselves honestly, who conducts the evening review, who applies the honest account, who closes the gap between the person they intend to be and the person their behavior is producing, that person already knows the verdict. They have conducted the trial themselves, with more information, more context, and more honest intention than any external jury could bring to it. And the verdict they have reached, imperfect, provisional, regularly updated as the honest account produces new evidence, is the only one that carries authority over the internal conditions. The external jury can deliver whatever verdict it chooses. The person who has examined themselves honestly receives that verdict not as an authority, but as a data point. Useful if it contains something the self-examination missed, irrelevant if it doesn't, but never authoritative, never the final word, never the judgment that the internal conditions are required to organize themselves around. This is emotional fortitude in the Stoic sense, not the thick skin that stops the criticism from landing, the examined life that ensures, when it does land, that there is already a verdict in place, one that was reached honestly, privately, without the distortion of the external jury's particular agenda. And that verdict, yours, reached from the inside, updated daily through the honest account, is the only one that was ever worth having. The internal foundation is now in place. But Stoicism is not an invisible practice. It is a visible standard. In the next video, I break down the Stoic standard, how the examined life communicates itself to the world through your presence and your appearance. If today was about the roots, that video is about the fruit. Click here to watch it next, and if this reached you today, leave a comment. Tell me which of these 5 points identified the work you've been avoiding. That is where we begin. I'll see you in the comments.